Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we drift into the life of a figure whose shadow still stretches across continents, a man born in the loneliness of the open steppe, a place where survival itself was a battle long before his name became legend. Before the world called him Genghis Khan, he was just a boy shaped by wind, hunger, and a childhood sharpened on the edge of exile. And in the quiet hours of night, as you listen, we'll walk beside him, step by step through the cold, unbroken grasslands that forged him. His story doesn't begin with an empire. It begins with a river, an omen, and a child wrapped in the raw silence of the Mongolian plains. The wind was the first voice he ever heard, a restless, wandering teacher that scraped the land clean and whispered warnings through the tall grass. Along the banks of the Anan River, that same wind carried the scent of horses, distant fires, and the quiet breath of predators hidden beyond the ridge. And it carried the cry of a newborn boy named Temujin, whose tiny fist, according to old tales, closed around a clot of blood. A sign, they said, that the world would one day remember him or fear him. Whether the omen was true or not, life made it real. Temujin was born into the Borjigin, a clan who claimed ancient descent from the blue wolf and the fallow doe, spirits that walked between myth and memory. His father Yesujay was a hardened chieftain, a rider who carved alliances and enmities with equal ease. His mother Holan carried a past marked by abduction, resilience, and the quiet strength that would one day keep her children alive when everyone else turned away. Temujin's name itself was born from conflict. Yesujay had taken a Tatar prisoner named Temujin. The defeated man's name was given to the newborn as a reminder, a private symbol, a small, burning echo of a victory between ancient rivals. Even in infancy, the boy carried a legacy of unfinished war. The steppe was his only classroom. Before Temujin could speak in full sentences, he could cling to a pony's back as it thundered across uneven earth. He learned to track the faintest print in frozen mud, to read the river by the heaviness of its sound, to sense danger in the shift of distant birds. Hunger was an early instructor too, always waiting, always near, reminding every child that the line between living and not had no mercy. Seasons were not mere weather, they were survival. Spring brought births, summer brought movement, autumn brought raids, and winter brought silence, a stillness heavy enough to break a careless family. Knowledge came from watching the sky, listening to horses breathe, studying how adults argued around the fire. Wisdom lived in instincts, not in scrolls. And then came the lesson that changed everything. At perhaps 9 years old, Temujin was betrothed to Bert of the Angjarat, a quiet arrangement meant to bind families. But on the journey home, Yesujay stopped among Tatars who recognized him, remembered old wounds, and poisoned him with a gesture as casual as offering a bowl. He reached camp alive, but only long enough to say goodbye. A dead chieftain left no protection. The Teyachiad, once loyal, walked away. They took the herds, the tents, the tools, everything except a grieving woman and her children. The steppe did not soften for them. It watched, indifferent, as Holan clawed roots from cold soil, taught her children to snare rodents, to cut holes through river ice, to hide their few remaining horses deep in the dark. Those years carved Temujin into something quiet and hard, something waiting, something the world was not prepared to meet. The line between hunger and survival was thin on the steppe, sometimes no thicker than the weight of a rabbit caught in the fading light of dusk. Temujin learned early that life could hinge on small things. A hidden root beneath frozen earth, the warmth of a pony's flank in winter, or a single breath taken at the right moment. Those years, shaped by cold wind and emptiness, carved themselves deeply into him. They taught him that kin could abandon you, that blood did not guarantee loyalty, and that mercy was as rare as food in the deep bite of February. But they also taught him something else, that a small household bound tightly by purpose could survive more than any clan expected. In those harsh lessons, Temujin began building something no one could yet see. A network of trust made not from birthright but from choice. And the first threads of that network appeared in the least expected places. One night when the Teocheid captured him, they locked a heavy wooden collar, a kankga, around his neck, displaying him in their camp like a symbol of humiliation. During a drunken feast, Temujin slipped free and fled into the darkness, stumbling toward the river, the collar dragging through dirt behind him. In the reeds, breathless and terrified, he found a man named Sorkin Shira, a poor herdsman, one who could have earned favor by handing him over. Instead, Sorkin Shira lifted the collar from the boy's neck, pulled him into his own jur, and hid him as if he were one of his own sons. He risked his life not for gold, not for rank, but because the moment demanded a kind heart. Years later, when Temujin commanded thousands and the world had begun to tremble beneath his horsemen, he remembered. He raised Sorkin Shira's family from poverty to honor. That small act of kindness became a private rule he carried until his final days. Never forget those who help you when you have nothing, and never overlook the humble. Another thread in his forming brotherhood was Buorchu. Temujin had lost a horse to raiders and met Buorchu while tracking it. The youth asked no payment, made no demands. He simply mounted his horse and rode with Temujin through the night. Together they recovered the stolen animals. When asked what reward he wanted, Buorchu only said he would stay. And he did through battles, winters, and the long climb from obscurity. Later, Buorchu would lead great forces across northern China, trusted silently in moments when older nobles hesitated. Gelmi joined them soon after, a man from the Uriankai who dressed Temujin's wounds and brought him back from the edge of death. There were others too, names lost in the dust of time, appearing only for a page or a breath. But their pattern was unmistakable. Temujin's earliest followers came not from noble birth, but from character, loyalty, and the quiet bonds formed in moments of danger. Yet even within his household, darkness was not far. One of the most defining storms of his youth came from within his own blood. During a season of sharp hunger, Temujin and his half-brother Begter argued over meat, that precious currency of survival, and over authority within the family. In a split moment shaped by anger and fear, Temujin and his full brother Kasar shot Begter down with arrows. The boy lay still on the cold earth. Their mother, Holun, cursed the act with a grief that cut deeper than winter. She told them they had made enemies not of other clans but of their own shadows. It was a moment that welded itself to Temujin's conscience, a line crossed that no elder approved. Later, when his rivals knelt before him expecting death, he sometimes remembered that day. And though he was never a gentle man, he chose restraint more often than any who opposed him expected. Not always, but more often. Amid these shadows was a brighter thread, the friendship of Jamaka. The two boys grew up sharing milk and stories, sleeping under the same rough blankets, dreaming the same wild dreams. They swore the old oath of Anda, a bond that made friends into brothers, to share life, meet hardship, and destiny as equals. For a time, the promise held beautifully. But in adulthood, ambition has a way of reshaping brotherhood. What began as two boys sharing hopes would eventually become one of the most famous rivalries in steppe history. A saga of loyalty, betrayal, forgiveness, and the cruel necessities of power. As Temujin gathered his companions, he also began learning the larger games, the politics of the steppe, which could be as unpredictable as a winter storm. He watched the Karaite under their ruler Togrul, whom the Chinese called Ayn Khan. He observed the Naiman to the west and the Tatars to the southeast. He listened to rumors of Jin-sponsored raids designed to keep the tribes divided and weak. Slowly, carefully, he began to understand that survival required more than courage. It required a patron, a powerful shield beneath which a future could be built. That opportunity arrived in the form of a gift. When Temujin reached manhood, he traveled to claim Bert, the girl promised to him years earlier. The Anjarat elders honored the agreement and sent her with a dowry, which included a sable coat of rare value. Temujin could have kept this treasure, but he did not. Instead, he rode south until he found the camp of Togrul. There he offered the coat as a symbol, a request to be welcomed as a son, in memory of the former friendship between Togrul and Temujin's father Yesujay. The Karaite ruler accepted. He drank with Temujin, called him my son, and promised protection. For the first time, Temujin stood not as a hunted orphan, but as a man with a patron, a future, and allies made through wisdom rather than weapons. The alliance with Togrul became a window into a different world, one where a leader governed not simple raiding bands, but a broader, more intricate polity. The Karaite were Christians of the Nestorian rite and traded with China. Their camp hummed with the movements of envoys, merchants, priests, and spies. Temujin watched everything: how a Khan greeted messengers, how he distributed spoils, how he punished betrayal, how he honored loyalty. He was not copying them, he was learning what scale looked like. Even then, beneath the armor he would one day wear, something deeply spiritual lived within him. A moment recorded in the secret history tells of Temujin climbing the slopes of Burkhan Khaldun to escape enemies. Terrified, exhausted, he prayed to the mountain and to eternal heaven, vowing that if he survived, he would honor the place for the rest of his life. He kept that vow. He later declared the mountain sacred and ordered all who traveled there to show respect. This glimpse reveals a truth often overlooked. Temujin was not a cold skeptic. He believed in the watchful presence of heaven, the weight of oaths, and the terrible consequences of breaking them. His later insistence on protecting envoys, even from his enemies, grew from these early convictions. During these years, he also sharpened the art of steppe warfare. He learned to break a pursuit, to lure an enemy into a trap, to signal across vast distances with flags, torches, and smoke. He had no siege engines, no infantry formations, no written commands. What he did have was a fierce intelligence, the ability to see opportunity in chaos, to transform a skirmish into something decisive. And always at the center of his skill was the bow. The Mongol bow, layered from horn, sinew, and wood, was short enough to use from horseback yet powerful enough to pierce armor at remarkable distances. Riders could fire while hanging off the side of their horses, turning their own bodies into moving shields. Children practiced these maneuvers for sport, warriors refined them to live. Beyond the grasslands lay a world Temujin had only heard whispers of cities, kingdoms, and empires with their own ambitions. To him, they were distant rumors. But not for long. The winds that moved across the steppe carried many things: the scent of distant rain, the warning of riders, the low hum of approaching storms. But sometimes, on still nights when the fire burned low, they also carried stories from worlds Temujin had never seen. Chinese traders came to the borders with bolts of silk that glimmered like water and iron pots, hammered smooth by hands that worked in places far beyond the horizon. With them came tales of walls that stretched along mountains like sleeping dragons, and of cities built in perfect squares, so large and so orderly that a man could walk for hours and still feel the breath of stone rising around him. Merchants from the Islamic lands followed the same wind paths. They brought glass polished so clear it caught the moonlight like captured stars, and cloth dyed in colors richer than anything the grassland could grow. They told Temujin and his companions of markets so vast that a man might wander them for a whole year and never step into the same stall twice. To a young man who had known hunger and cold more intimately than comfort, these stories were not temptations, they were warmth. A brief flicker of light against a life still balancing on the edge of survival. But Temujin's world, for now, was far smaller and far more urgent. His concerns sharpened down to 3 rules: keep the horses healthy, keep the family fed, keep the friends you have, and gain a few more. His story did not yet rush toward empire. It moved slowly, the way a river shapes stone, beginning not with a throne but with a felt tent and a quiet promise. He sat with Bert beneath the layered hides of their jur, the precious sable coat, once the finest thing he owned, now resting in Togrul's hands. Jelmi, loyal and steady, shared meat beside them, speaking softly about the ride that lay ahead. And somewhere beyond the reach of firelight, Jamaka, the sworn brother of his youth, thought of the day when he and Temujin might ride side by side once more. The boy who once dug roots from frozen soil was learning a new art. Arranging people with the same care he once arranged snares for rabbits. And outside, the wind pressed its cold palm against the tent walls, whispering approval through the seams. But dawn on the steppe is a creature with two faces. And on that morning, a morning that would stay with Temujin all his life, it showed its cruelest one. His camp lay quiet along a shallow fold of ground by the Anan River. Thin smoke curled upward from the dying night fires. Horses grazed lazily where the first pale light touched the grass. The men on watch felt a little too comfortable, a little too safe. And that was when the Murkit came. They rose from the early dawn like crows lifting off a single carcass, dark shapes against a cold horizon. They came for vengeance, vengeance for the woman taken from them long ago. They came for Holan's memory, for old wounds, and for new cruelty. They came for women. They found what they were looking for. The attack was swift, brutal, perfectly timed. Temujin and his small gathering had no chance to hold. He fought long enough to shield his family, but the camp shattered around them. He fled with only a few companions, driving his horses toward the slopes of Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain that had already shaped his fate once. Bert could not escape. She was taken, along with other women and children, carried north toward the Murkit pastures, an echo of Holan's own capture, but this time without the thread of alliance, without the promise of a new life. This abduction was not a beginning. It was a wound. In the stone and birch hollows of Burkhan Khaldun, Temujin prayed. He prayed to the sky, to the earth, to eternal heaven. His voice trembled with grief and fury. He swore that if the mountain sheltered him now, he would honor it forever. And then he sent word to the two men whose answers mattered most. Togrul, Jamaka both answered. On the steppe, blood and oath carried a weight that iron could not match. What followed was the first great command Temujin would help shape. The Karaite came in full strength, their banners thick in the wind. Jamaka rode in with a tide of warriors from his noble lineage. Temujin, still young and untested, brought only a small band, but they rode with purpose. Together they followed the trail of the raiders across rivers and through narrow, willow-woven valleys. The Murkit had carried their captives to a camp they believed safe, protected by kin and distance. But safety is a dangerous illusion on the steppe. The allied riders descended on the camp with the force of a storm. Arrows hissed and fell like drifting thistles. The Murkit broke and scattered along the streams, fleeing into the shadows of the land. Bert was found alive. Temujin held her, the fear and relief merging into something fierce and wordless. Holan's younger sister was also rescued, and in the space between loss and triumph, a bond was forged, a bond that would define the decade to come. What rose from that victory was more than a camp. It was a living classroom. The Karaite arrived with clerks, warriors, priests of the Nestorian rite, and messengers who knew the intricate tracks leading to Jin territory. Jamaka's followers brought refinement, the confidence of old pedigree, and the sharp eyes of men raised for leadership. Temujin's circle was smaller, humbler, but bound by loyalty deeper than tradition. For a time, the three camps lived as one. They hunted together. They feasted from the same kettles. They told stories that polished old legends and carved new ones into memory. But even moments of peace carry their own dangerous seeds. During these months, Bert gave birth to Jachai, a child whose arrival lit a quiet fuse beneath the future. She had been among the Murkit long enough for whispers to rise, the kind that travel in a nomad camp like smoke under a tent flap. Temujin accepted Jachai as his son without hesitation, and he treated him as such in every public act. But the whisper remained. And later, years later, that whisper would be sharpened into a blade by brothers who sought an edge over one another. For now, the child was a symbol of survival, proof that the family had endured a blow meant to break them. As the camp lived and breathed around him, Temujin watched everything. He watched Togrul decide matters with startling speed. He watched how the Karat patrols used signals to warn of strangers along distant ridges. He watched Jamaka maintain the loyalty of nobles with gifts, and how quickly he lost their respect with a single careless remark. He began to see how pride could rot friendship, how jealousy grew in silence, how alliances shifted like migrating herds. And so, before bitterness could take root, Temujin made his choice. He gathered his family and followers and prepared to leave the joined camp. Holun saw the danger before he spoke it. She knew well when gratitude became a leash. Bert agreed, calm and thoughtful as ever. Temujin met with Jamaka, and though they used the words of brotherhood, both felt the quiet friction beneath them. When he struck his camp and rode away, 41 households followed him. They followed not out of fear, nor out of hunger for gold, but because they had watched how Temujin kept a promise, how he divided meat fairly, how he never forgot the poor. With that choice, the tension between the two Andas, the childhood brothers, opened like a crack across frozen water. Over the next years, camps drifted like loose sand across the plains. Pastures, rivers, alliances, everything shifted. Every tribe measured and remeasured their position. The Tatars, sometimes favored by the Jin dynasty, kept their distance. The Tayachiad, who once abandoned Holun and hunted Temujin as a boy, waited in the shadows of their old resentment. The storm of the steppe was gathering. Temujin felt it in the wind. The Merkits smoldered like coals left under ash, their anger waiting for the wind that would bring it back to flame. They searched for allies, whispered with old rivals, and watched Temujin with an unease that felt almost like dread. But while they schemed outward, Temujin's focus turned inward, toward the ground beneath his own feet, toward the men who rode beside him. He began to shape them quietly, patiently. He broke the old tribal groups and mixed warriors from different families into teams of 10 and then hundreds. These were not yet the mighty regiments he would one day command, but the seeds of something far larger, a new way of thinking, a new way of fighting. Service would matter more than blood. Loyalty would matter more than lineage. And the steppe, though it did not yet know it, was beginning its transformation through his hands. War finally announced itself at a place remembered as Dalan Baltshut, a name the steppe would whisper for generations. Jamaka arrived with the confidence of noble birth behind him. He held the older names, the larger following, and the backing of clans who feared the very idea of Temujin. They wanted no world where a herdsman's son might stand above a prince. They clung to the old order like a dying flame. They wanted feasts where rank dictated who drank first. They wanted safety in tradition. Temujin represented change, and change frightened them more than steel. When the two hosts met, the sky swarmed with kestrels, circling as if called by something ancient and hungry. The ground trembled beneath hooves as if the earth itself anticipated the clash. Temujin's men fought like wolves cornered in winter, fierce but too few. He took a wound, lost blood, and escaped only because fate and instinct pulled him toward survival. But Jamaka was not content with simple victory. He took the captives, the leaders Temujin had trusted, and ordered them boiled alive. The cruelty did not serve strength, it served fear. And that fear corroded Jamaka's following more effectively than any sword. Men who stood beneath his banners felt shame burning under their skin. Some left quietly. Some walked away in broad daylight. And they drifted toward Temujin, where they found no punishment, no mockery, no demand for penance. They found forgiveness and purpose. Temujin did not despair after Dalan Baltshut. He had no time for despair. Instead, he did what he always did. He moved, he listened, he rebuilt. There are hints, faint echoes in old accounts that he spent time in the lands of the Jin dynasty. Perhaps he served as a mercenary. Perhaps he was taken prisoner and convinced his captors of his value. The Chinese later wrote of a Mongol leader who learned their customs before returning to the steppe with sharper eyes. Whether they meant Temujin or someone close to him, the impact was clear. When he returned, something in him had widened. He understood the power beyond the frontier, the weight of bureaucracy, the depth of their armies, the strategies they favored, and the cracks in their armor. And he understood how frontier politics could be bent to serve him. By the mid-1190s, the steppe had shifted once again. Temujin settled old scores with precision, a mix of ruthless strikes and unexpected pardons. He turned against the Tatars, the ancient antagonists of his family. His campaign cut through their pastures like a blade slicing felt. Chiefs fell, clans scattered, and the common warriors, impressed by his fairness and clarity, folded into his ranks. One prisoner stepped forward and confessed that he had shot Temujin's horse from beneath him in battle. Rather than kill him, Temujin admired his honesty and courage. He spared him and gave him a new name. Jib the Arrow. Jib would become one of his most brilliant commanders, a man who read the land as if it whispered secrets only he could hear. Temujin's alliance with Togrul, the Karaite ruler, also deepened. When a rebellion rose against the aging Khan, Temujin rode to his aid, crushed the uprising, and restored him to power. Togrul loved him for it, like a father loves a capable son, but others watched the growing bond with tightening jaws. Temujin's prestige was rising, and prestige on the steppe was a blade with two edges. It attracted followers and sharpened envy. The Jin dynasty called upon its steppe allies in 1196 to punish rebel Tatars. Temujin answered. He fought fiercely, sent back heads and prisoners, and received titles and gifts in return. His enemies were confused. Was he a servant of China, a threat, a bridge between worlds? But Temujin took only what strengthened him and returned nothing that cost him power. Meanwhile, his household grew and shifted. His sons began to ride with small companions, learning leadership the way a child learns balance on a horse. Jachai showed kindness and courage. Chagatai showed a stern love for justice. Ogedei won allies through warmth. Talyui, the youngest, carried a spark that men noticed even when he was small. Temujin watched them the same way he watched his officers, studying their temper, their strengths, their flaws. He arranged marriages that bound tribes closer. He listened to Bert, whose soft voice shaped decisions more than outsiders ever knew. And he listened to Holan, who spoke truth like an arrow, blunt and straight. But the quiet longing to restore brotherhood with Jamaka lingered, like smoke from a fire long burned out. They exchanged messages, attempted small reconciliations, and reached for memories that childhood had carved into them. But childhood could not compete with the world they now lived in. Jamaka could not accept a society where merit overshadowed noble birth. Temujin would never kneel to the old hierarchy again. Their words tried to meet. Their paths did not. And so men continued to leave Jamaka's camp, pulled by conscience, by anger, by ambition, or by prophecy. They came to Temujin with different stories, but a shared hope that his camp was a place where justice breathed a little cleaner. He accepted them one by one with a measured hand. He scattered them through different units so no man would serve only beside his cousins. That decision, small then, would become the backbone of an empire. By the turn of the century, Temujin had failed, risen, learned, and risen again. He had grown beyond the narrow world of raiding and revenge. He was beginning to speak of something larger, a work that would shape the future of every tribe on the steppe. The world was not ready for him, but men had begun to listen. On a late autumn night, under a sky heavy with cold stars, Temujin sat in council with Buorchu, Jelmi, Jib, and the elders. The fire crackled low, and the wind pressed against the tent walls like a restless spirit. The fire burned low, its glow rising and falling like a tired heartbeat. Around it, faces emerged in islands of light, stern jaws, tired eyes, hands wrapped in wool or leather, and the rest dissolved into darkness. Outside, the wind pulled at the hide walls of the tent as if trying to listen. Inside, Temujin and his closest men spoke quietly, not of glory, not of revenge, but of winter, where to move when the first snows came. Which tribe had grown stiff and brittle, ready to split under the weight of its own pride? Which ally would stand firm if asked to choose between the comfort of old rank and the promise of something new? Beyond the fire's reach, a young rider stood in the cold with 2 horses, waiting for a message that might send him across half a continent. His coat was thin, his breath fogged heavily in the moonlight, and he had no idea that he was holding the reins of a future he could not yet imagine, a nation not yet born. For now, he knew only that standing beside a warm animal could keep the night from eating into his bones. The years after Temujin reclaimed Bert were not marked by sudden leaps or easy triumphs. They were slow, grinding, measured, the kind of ascent built one loyalty, one promise, one fragile alliance at a time. The steppe is a land of long distances, and power grows the same way. It expands mile by mile, camp by camp, name by name. A leader must prove he can feed men in winter, enrich them in summer, and keep his word when setbacks come, and they always come. By the turn of the century, Temujin's name traveled farther than any rider. And men said it with different tones, some with hope, some with fear, some with curiosity. Jamaka's victory at Dalan Baltshut had not ended the struggle. It had sharpened it like a whetstone dragged across a blade. Men remembered the boiling of captives, the mutilations, the cruelty that seeped into the soil. They understood what kind of future that promised. And so they began drifting, quietly at first, toward Temujin's camp. There they found something different. A man of low birth could sit close to the fire if he had served well. Loot was divided by contribution, not ancestry. The quarrels were settled quickly and without favoritism. It wasn't gentle, nothing on the steppe was, but it was fair. And fairness was a kind of warmth older clans no longer gave. Temujin rebuilt with patience. He raided when it mattered. He waited when he needed to wait. He leaned on Togrul when he required protection and offered strength in return. When a Karaite revolt rose, Temujin smothered it with speed and precision. Togrul praised him, calling him son, offering grazing lands that made winter survivable. Their relationship grew into something strange, part affection, part calculation. Temujin needed a shield while he gathered strength. Togrul needed a younger man with fire in his blood. Old enemies, however, were handled without warmth at all. The Tatars, who poisoned Temujin's father, felt the full weight of his vengeance. He struck them with clean, decisive force, cutting down their leaders and scattering their people. Adult men who resisted were executed. Their families were absorbed into his growing ranks. Among those taken prisoner was a bowman who stepped forward and admitted he had once shot Temujin's horse from beneath him in battle. Death seemed certain. But Temujin admired courage, even when it came from an enemy. He spared the man and gave him a new name, Jib, the Arrow. That single act changed history. Jib would become one of the greatest commanders the world had ever seen, a man whose instincts carved fear into distant kingdoms. By 1201, the steppe split into 2 worlds. One side gathered beneath Jamaka and the older families, men who believed noble blood alone earned noble place. They remembered old glory, old rules, old patterns. The other side gathered around Temujin, an idea as much as a man that talent and loyalty could rise higher than birth. That skill mattered more than family. That a herdsman's son could sit beside a prince if he proved his worth. The lines were messy, as all steppe lines are. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides. Friends whispered doubts in the dark. A man might admire Jamaka's elegance yet fear his cruelty. A man might mistrust Temujin's bold reforms but crave the fairness of his camp. The steppe was no chessboard. It was a living web of grudges, marriages, bargains, and shifting calculations about grass and water. And the web tightened. Jamaka's supporters proclaimed him Gur Khan, a title heavy with ancient pride. They rallied the Teachiud, the Naaman, and other clans wounded by Temujin's rise. Temujin and Togrul stood together, their alliance strong but surrounded by suspicion. The clash came at Yedi Kuman. Temujin and Togrul fought not with brute force but with patience, letting the enemy tire, drawing them across open ground, striking when the air shifted. They held their lines. They proved that new loyalties could stand against old names, and men noticed. The next year, Temujin finished what he had begun with the Tatars, absorbing their common warriors and breaking the old hierarchy. He began forming new units, groups of 10, then 100, mixing men from different clans so their loyalty pointed upward, toward him, rather than sideways toward cousins. It was a quiet revolution, one that would one day reshape the world. Meanwhile, tension with the Karaite deepened. Temujin proposed a marriage. His eldest son Jachai should wed a daughter of Togrul, a simple, common steppe custom. But nothing was simple anymore. Whispers followed Jachai like a shadow. Some nobles saw the proposal as disrespect. Sengum, Togrul's son, felt his inheritance threatened and his pride bruised. Jamaka fueled the unrest, reminding the nobles that Temujin raised common men to positions once reserved for ancient bloodlines. An ambush was planned, but the steppe has ears everywhere. Two herdsmen tending their animals overheard the plot and ran with the news to Temujin's tent. Under the dark sky, he slipped away with his closest followers, leaving behind a camp already tightening into a trap. What followed was peril without pause. At Kalakaljid Sands, Temujin suffered a devastating defeat. His warriors were scattered, his camp was torn apart, his family came within a breath of capture. For a moment, a brief, terrible moment, it seemed the story might end in the old way, with a victor holding trophies over a feast and another dream swallowed by the hunger of the steppe. The escape that saved Temujin's life and the oath that rose from its ashes became one of the deepest roots in Mongol memory. It was not a moment dressed in glory. It wasn't won by numbers or prestige. It was carved out of exhaustion, hunger, and the kind of loyalty that is born only in the darkest hours of a man's life. Temujin and a scattered handful of followers reached a lonely waterhole remembered as Baljuna. Their horses were spent to trembling. Their supplies were gone. The cold bit through leather and cloth as if the night itself wanted them to vanish. With nothing left to give his men, Temujin cut down his own horse. He butchered the animal himself. He cooked its meat for the followers who had not abandoned him. They mixed muddy water with mare's milk and passed the bowl around. Each man drank from it not because it tasted good, but because it kept the breath inside their bodies. There, standing in mud and smoke, surrounded by defeat on every horizon, they swore an oath. If heaven allowed them to rise again, they would share hardship and wealth, and never forget the men who stood knee-deep in mud beside this water. These men came from different clans, different bloodlines, even different religions. But that night, none of that mattered. What bound them together was choice, the kind of bond more powerful than ancestry. Later historians would try to blur this moment, embarrassed that so many of Temujin's most loyal supporters were not strictly Mongol by blood. But the men who lived it knew better. They called themselves the Baljuna Companions, and Temujin trusted them with his life for the rest of his days. Recovery did not come through luck. It came through strategy. Temujin split his weakened forces, used a false retreat to lure Karaite detachments into ground he had already studied, and then hit them with a sudden flank attack. Men who had waited silently in gullies and tall grass erupted like a storm against the enemy line. The Karaite broke. Their formations collapsed. The alliance that had once threatened Temujin crumbled. Togrul, the old Khan who had been like a father, fled the battlefield. He died at the hands of strangers who didn't even know whom they had killed. Sengum ran for refuge toward distant lands. And Temujin swallowed the Karaite people whole, just as he had absorbed the Tatars. He married into the fallen royal family, turning rivals into kin. His sons were bound to Karaite daughters, stitching the defeated bloodlines into his growing household. Among them came Sorgektani, a quiet, intelligent young woman whose descendants would one day shape empires far from these plains. With the Karaite shattered, only one great confederation remained capable of standing in Temujin's way. The Nayman. They were a formidable people, a nation with eyes always turned both east and west. trading with ancient kingdoms beyond the Altai and carrying wisdom from the fading Khitan world. Their leader Tayang Khan had courage but little certainty. Beside him stood Kuchlug, young, fierce but reckless, a spark without direction. Jamukha, the once beloved friend, now shadowed rival, found shelter among them. He whispered warnings, strike Temujin now before his momentum becomes a storm no one can stop. The Nayman listened. The clash came high in the mountains, in a place remembered as Chakarmout, cold winds scraping across stone, the air thin, the valleys tight enough to swallow screams. By now, Temujin's army had grown into a creature of precision. Scouts rode ahead and along the flanks. Smoke signals and black banners carried orders faster than sound. The heart of his force remained his horse archers, riders who could rain arrows like a storm and then crash forward behind lances and sabers. The Nayman tried to lure Temujin into broken, uneven ground where his ponies would lose their advantage. But Jib the arrow and Kassar felt for the weak seams in the enemy line. They pierced them again and again. The battle stretched into days. When the Nayman finally broke, they shattered like ice under a thaw. Tayang Khan died. Kuchlug fled west with a handful of followers. Jamukha disappeared into the hills, a shadow fleeing deeper into the mountains. And the Nayman Confederation joined the long list of peoples absorbed into Temujin's rising order. Then came the end of the longest rivalry of Temujin's youth, the strange, heavy, almost tragic closing of the story between him and Jamukha. Jamukha's own men betrayed him. They bound him and dragged him to Temujin, hoping their treachery would earn them reward. Instead, Temujin ordered them executed. To him, loyalty mattered more than convenience. Betrayers could not be trusted, not even when they brought him the one enemy he had chased for years. Only then did he speak to Jamukha, offering forgiveness and a return to brotherhood if Jamukha would accept a place beneath him in this new order. Jamukha refused. He asked for a noble death, one that spilled no blood, the last privilege of a prince. Temujin granted it. The two men spoke quietly, remembering the days when they shared a single blanket, shared the same bowl of milk, shared the same dreams under the same endless sky. And then the boyhood friend was gone. A chapter that began with warm hands and childhood promises ended with cold wind brushing against the hills. With the last great rival removed, the steppe opened like a vast door. Temujin summoned the tribes to a grand assembly beside the waters of the upper Anan. Chiefs, elders, and the new commanders, men who owed their rank not to blood, but to service, gathered under the broad sky. There, with voices rising in a tide, they proclaimed him, Genghis Khan. Scholars still debate the meaning. Some hear the deep sound of the ocean, a ruler vast, unstoppable. Others hear firmness, the unmoving one. Whatever its root, the effect was unmistakable. A man who had survived poverty, slavery, betrayal, defeat, and exile now stood as ruler of a united people. But this was not just a change of name. It was a change of the entire world. Genghis Khan weakened the old ties of clan and strengthened loyalty to the center. He organized his army into tens, hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands. He mixed warriors from defeated tribes with his own, so no man rode only beside cousins. He enlarged his personal guard, the Keshik, choosing men from every lineage. They lived near him, learned command, and formed the seed of future generals. He ordered the keeping of written lists. He demanded honesty in dividing plunder. He punished theft, desertion, and the harming of envoys. He protected priests, monks, imams, and physicians, those who served all people. He adopted the Uyghur script and filled his camp with scribes. He envisioned stations with fresh horses so messages could fly across his lands like wind. These changes grew quickly, but their roots reached back into the years when he mixed clans, watched Uyghur clerks work, and dreamed of an order greater than the chaos of tribal feuds. The transformation also touched those closest to him. Temujin rewarded the Baljuna companions richly. Boorchu and Jelmi received honors fit for legends. Jib the Arrow was given freedom to design campaigns that would one day shake entire continents. Mukali rose as a quiet pillar of discipline and loyalty. The women, the true spine of the households, also came into the light. Bert remained the steady center of the great tent. Holun, who once dug roots from frozen earth to keep her children alive, watched as the boy who once slept at her side became a ruler who commanded nations. And the steppe, for the first time in generations, began to follow a single name: Genghis Khan. When the chiefs lifted Temujin upon a felt carpet and raised their voices to call him Genghis Khan, the sound rolled across the Anan like thunder breaking over distant hills. It echoed through the valleys and drifted across the river, carried by wind as if the steppe itself had paused to listen. This was not the ending of a struggle. It was the opening of an entirely new one. For the first time in generations, a people who had once lived in scattered tribes now stood beneath a single name. But unity alone was not enough. A nation needed shape, not just spirit. It needed rules men would willingly obey, officers they trusted, roads that could carry orders faster than rumor, and a purpose that reached beyond personal revenge. The steppe had seen conquerors before, brilliant raiders with fierce hearts and short horizons. But never had it seen a conqueror who intended to build. Genghis began with foundations as practical as saddle leather. He reinforced the decimal system that had carried him through earlier battles: units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. It was more than organization. It was a quiet revolution. Cousins no longer rode only beside cousins. Clans were mixed until old bloodlines blurred. Rank came from ability and loyalty, not ancestry. A man who once mended saddles could, if he showed courage and a steady mind, find himself in command of 100 riders. The nobles sneered at first, but when these new formations moved through dust and danger like a single breathing creature, even the proudest lips fell silent. Beside the Khan himself stood the Keshig, the day and night guard, the beating heart of this new order. It began as a small circle of trusted men, but soon grew into a kind of living school for leadership. Promising young warriors from every lineage were brought into its ranks. They slept near the Khan's fire, carried messages no one else could carry, and learned the rhythm of councils, the weight of written orders, and the discipline required to hold the empire together. The great families learned something too. Their sons now lived close enough to hear decisions as they were made, close enough to be shaped by the center of power. Then came the law. We call it the Yasa, though no single tablet or scroll held its entirety. It lived in proclamations shouted in smoky tents, in decisions recorded by scribes, and in the memories of commanders who carried its spirit from camp to camp. Its heartbeat was simple: steal livestock and justice would fall quickly. Spill blood inside the sacred circle of tents and punishment was swift. Abandon a comrade in battle and your fate was sealed. Loot was to be counted carefully, divided fairly, and recorded. Jealousy was poison to discipline. Women were not to be abducted, people were not to be sold like trade goods. And above everything, envoys were sacred. To touch a messenger was to challenge the Khan himself and the fragile order he was binding to the land. Yet for all this strictness, religion was given room to breathe. Genghis saw no advantage in making faith into a blade. Nestorian monks walked the same paths as Buddhist lamas. Muslim scholars prayed beside their imams and judged disputes among their own. Shamans still lifted their drums, calling upon spirits older than memory. As the empire grew wider, stretching from frozen forests to blistering desert, tolerance became more than kindness. It became a tool of survival. Genghis Khan gave his words wings. Couriers needed more than courage. They needed horses waiting at set distances, homes that would open their doors, and a sign of authority that silenced hesitation. So the Khan built the Yam, a great chain of relay posts threading through mountain passes and river valleys. Each post kept fresh mounts, fodder, and men who knew exactly what to do. A courier carried a pesa, a metal tablet engraved with authority. With it, he could demand a horse, shelter, or provisions. Orders now moved faster than any enemy could respond. News reached the Khan before gossip could twist it. Commerce flowed along the same veins. Caravans needed protection and the army needed supplies. So Genghis partnered with merchants, Orthodox men from Central Asia who provided goods in exchange for security and privilege. For the first time, tax replaced plunder. Plunder became planning. Planning became power. A clerk near the Karakorum and a quartermaster on the Oxus could read the same list of goods and trust the numbers. The empire was learning to breathe in unison. Only then did Genghis turn outward. To the southwest lay western Xia, the Tangut kingdom pressed between desert and river. It wasn't as vast as the Jin Empire, but it was wealthy, fortified, and proud. Genghis had measured their strength before. Now he meant to measure their submission. In 1205, he sent out testing strikes. In 1209, he returned with thunder behind him. The heart of Xia was Zhangxing, today's Yinshuan, guarded by walls and the curve of the Yellow River like a giant's protective arm. Mongols ruled the open world of wind and grass, but walls were a different kind of enemy. Genghis refused to bow to stone. He gathered engineers, Chinese, Khitan, and others and set them to work. Stone throwers rattled across the plains. Mangonels thumped at the earth. Sappers dug like moles beneath the walls. One tale says they even tried to bend the Yellow River itself to drown the city. The waters turned against them, but the story mattered more than the outcome, because it showed that Genghis Khan would use water, fire, and foreign wisdom as easily as arrow and horse. After long pressure, Xia yielded. They offered tribute, hostages, and a marriage alliance. The Khan accepted and withdrew, richer not only in treasure, but in time and silence along that frontier. His eyes turned then to the greater weight on the horizon, the Jin dynasty, a kingdom whose border ran like a hard iron line across the grass. And in the year 1211, Genghis summoned his commanders for a campaign no Mongol leader had dared attempt in a generation. The world beyond the steppe was about to tremble. The Mongol army moved south like a slow-gathering storm. Ahead of them rose the dark ridges of the mountain wall and the great stone spine of the Great Wall, cutting across the northern plain like a boundary drawn by an ancient hand. The air was thin and cold in the passes. Horses snorted frost. Leather creaked. The world seemed to shrink into narrow corridors of rock and shadow. Scouts rode far ahead, searching not for the strongest gates but for the forgotten ones, the side paths, the hunting tracks, the half-ruined watch roads where patrols had grown lazy. The Mongols whispered with guides who knew the terrain better than any map. They bribed villagers who lived in the long shadow of Jin rule. They listened to subject peoples who felt no loyalty to their Jurchen overlords. The army did not throw itself against strength. It flowed toward weakness. And when they found an opening, a neglected ravine, a half-collapsed fort, a gap in the cliffs, they slipped through it like wind through broken stone. Once they reached the plains beyond, the Mongol host widened and spread, not like an army of separate tribes, but like water released into a furrow, smooth, coordinated, purposeful. Columns moved across the land in deliberate patterns. Signals flickered across distances. Dust rose in controlled lines. For the Jin defenders, it was like facing a river that split and merged, vanishing in one place and erupting in another. Feigned retreats pulled Jin armies out of the safety of their walls. When they chased, believing the enemy to be fleeing, the Mongols turned on them suddenly, sharply, and shattered them with storms of arrows that hissed like swarms of bees. When the Jin assembled enormous forces to face them, the Mongols did not crash against the center. They flowed around it. They rode wide, severing supply lines and leaving the great army stranded, hungry, and bewildered. A cavalry that could travel 50 or 60 miles in a day was no longer just terrifying. It became a tool of strategy so new that settled kingdoms struggled to even describe it. City after city faced the same cold arithmetic. Open your gates early and your people would be taxed, settled, and left alive. Fight, resist, kill Mongol warriors, and the punishment was absolute. It was not sentiment. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a ledger, a kind of vast, brutal accounting. Terror for the Khan was not an impulse. It was a way to reduce the cost of future wars, yet within this harshness lay a strange mercy. Artisans were spared. Clerks were recorded carefully. Scholars, scribes, and craftsmen were moved north, guarded like rare tools. Families with valuable skills were resettled with unexpected care. Genghis Khan could destroy cities, but he would not waste talent. Not every victory belonged to the Khan's own hand. Mukali, a commander with a quiet voice and iron resolve, became the pillar of Mongolia's new frontier. When Genghis returned to the steppe, he entrusted Mukali with the north, a responsibility few men could have carried. Mukali held the plains with patience. He expanded Mongol control with steady, unhurried pressure. He accepted surrenders, placed Dareg-Hachi officials to gather taxes, and used local administrators to keep courts functioning and granaries full. The Mongols were no longer simply conquerors. They were learning how to govern. The campaign forged legends. Jebe, once a prisoner spared through honesty, fought with a sense for the enemy so sharp it seemed supernatural. He attacked when weakness flickered. He stopped cold when danger hid beneath bait. His instincts would later carve fear into kingdoms far from these plains. Subutai, younger and quieter, watched, learned, and thought in terms of seasons. He studied river curves, winter winds, and mountain spines the way scribes studied ink on paper. His mind began to move along routes no one else saw, routes that one day would stretch across continents. Together, these men forged a style of war that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Within the army, the Khan's sons grew under the weight of command. Jachai, generous and steady, earned loyalty from surrendered peoples. Chagatai, stern and unbending, became the embodiment of law. Ogedei, patient and warm, soothed disputes before cracks could spread. Talyui, still young, absorbed everything with sharp, burning attention. Each rode in his own wing of the army. Each learned without the shadow of their father's constant supervision. In the evenings, Genghis listened to Bert, whose quiet words still shaped decisions that shaped empires. The question of succession hung silently in the air, a sealed jar left undisturbed. The Jin dynasty struggled to understand the force tearing into its borders. They sent army after army, only to strike at shadows. They moved their capital to Kaifeng, hoping distance might dull the blow. They opened negotiations when fear grew too heavy. In 1214, a treaty near Jiangdu promised gifts and retreat. The Mongols accepted. The Jin broke the agreement. They fled south, hoping to rebuild. The Mongols returned. In 1215, Jiangdu fell. Fire licked the night sky. The city that would one day become Beijing learned the price of defiance. Behind the destruction stood scribes, calm, methodical, recording surrendered families, measuring grain stores, weighing merchant claims. Uyghur clerks, Persian accountants, Chinese translators all moved between languages with ease. Genghis Khan listened. He learned how settled states collected taxes without killing their farmers. He learned how courts functioned. He learned how money moved like water. He did not become a bureaucrat. He became something sharper, a ruler who would use any idea from any people if it helped him build. The army learned as he learned. The siege engines traveled with them now, mangonels, counterweight throwers, siege carts. Firepots whined through the air on rope slings. Sappers tunneled like moles beneath walls. Engineers traveled in guarded wagons that never lacked food or tools. And behind the front lines came an entire world, smiths to mend armor, carpenters to fix broken wagons, physicians to set bones and save lives. A mobile empire breathing and moving like one vast body. Diplomacy rode alongside the arrows. Genghis Khan offered generous terms to tribes who submitted early. He married daughters and nieces to frontier chiefs, not as tokens, but as governors with real authority. A Biki, riding with her own guards, ruled trade routes the way others ruled kingdoms. Caravans moved because she saw to it that they moved. The old image of a wild, burning horde began to fade. A state was taking shape, one that could fight, tax, protect, and endure. Across the northern plain, the camps along the Oron settled into a rhythm. Orders rode along the Yam. Captives were sorted and reassigned. Artisans were placed where their skills mattered most. New units drilled until movements became instinct. Winter camps were laid out with the care of towns. Music drifted from tents where lords planned the next season. The Keshig stood silent at dawn as the Khan mounted his horse. And there was no sense of completion, no feeling that the great work had reached its end. The world beyond the plains was still wide, still waiting. And Genghis Khan had only just begun to shape it. There was a moment, quiet, thin, almost weightless, when the Mongols knew they had crossed a boundary no one could step back from. Behind them lay the broken banners of the Jin. Ahead stretched lands that had barely noticed the storm rising on the steppe. The horizon no longer ended in China. It opened westward with a dark and beckoning vastness. And Genghis Khan, with a new state forged from bone and blood, turned toward it. The first crack in that western door was Kublai, the wandering Nayman prince who had fled into the ruins of the old Karakorum realm. He had tormented Buddhist towns, squeezed Muslim cities, and carved resentment into every valley he passed. For men like that, the Mongols sent Jib. He rode after Kublai the way a hawk hunts a fleeing bird, unhurried, unrelenting, with an instinct for direction that felt almost supernatural. Through the green bowl of the Ili Valley, past Balasaghun's fading glory, and up into the thin air of the mountains where caravans gasped toward the sky, Jib hunted him. Kublai tried to rally weary settlements against their new pursuers. But the Mongols came light, fast, and unannounced. Resistance broke beneath them like frost under a hooves. Kublai fled into high passes, and there his story ended in a lonely death that left no more heirs and no more claims to his broken kingdom. The shock of it rolled across nations. With the Karakitai scattered, the Mongol frontier now brushed the borders of a far larger, richer realm, the empire of Khwarazm. Khwarazm stretched from the Aral Sea to the blue arteries of the Oxus, from caravan cities crowded with trade to the shadowed gateways of Khwarazm. Silk markets thrummed, coin clattered, stone minarets rose above riverside towns. Its ruler, Ala al-Din Muhammad, looked powerful on parchment and deeply divided in practice. His mother, the formidable Turkin Khatun, commanded her own faction of officers. Ministers schemed, generals glared. The court at Gurganj glittered like polished metal, but inside it was already cracked. The Mongols had one center. Khwarazm had many pulling against each other with every breath. Genghis Khan did not demand submission. He sent merchants. Caravans crossed the frontier in 1,218 carrying furs soft as nightfall, silver bright as river ice, and spices from the Far East. Trade was the first gesture, a polite knock on a neighbor's door. At Otrar, the governor Inalchuk opened that door with a blade. He seized the caravan, accused the merchants of spying, and had them killed. When Genghis sent envoys to demand justice, the Shah protected his governor and added an insult so deep it echoed like a curse. He shaved the beards of the envoys. He executed the rest. He sent one man home to describe their deaths. For the Mongols who held envoys sacred, it was not diplomacy. It was cosmological disorder, a tear in the world's rules. War followed as simply, as cleanly as a bowstring drawn to its limit. The War Council mapped rivers first. The Oxus and Sirdaria flowed like blue veins across the land, feeding cities with water and wealth. To conquer Khwarazm, the Mongols would not simply break walls. They would break the rhythm of a civilization. The army divided like a hand spreading its fingers. Jachai swept along the Sur, tasked with crushing Otrar and securing the northern corridor. Chagatai and Ogedei moved toward the jeweled cities of Bukhara and Samarkand. Talyui, youngest and sharp as a winter wind, rode south toward the mountains of Khwarazm. Jebe and Subutai, restless and tireless, rode everywhere, slicing between army groups, severing communication, scouting the roads no ordinary commander would dare trust. What followed was not a march, it was a slow encirclement of an entire kingdom. Otrar fell first, but not easily. For months, stones rained from engines. Tunnels crept beneath towers. The defenders fought like men who knew the world was watching. When the walls cracked and the Mongols poured through, the governor who had kindled the war was taken alive. Justice was exacted on him alone. The city around him became a warning. Beyond Otrar, river towns folded. The door to the heartland opened. Bukhara saw dust on the horizon and knew the old arguments had cost them everything. Some had urged caution. Some had trusted the Shah. Now they stood on the walls and watched an army emerge from empty land, an army that had crossed deserts with water in leather skins and riders, whose endurance seemed inhuman. Bukhara's citadel resisted briefly. Then it cracked. Persian chroniclers later claimed Genghis Khan stood in the mosque and spoke, not as a preacher, but as a conqueror who listed the price of betrayal. Whether those lines were exact or sharpened by memory, the meaning sank in. The city had fallen because those who should have kept faith had chosen pride instead. Samarkand, grander and stronger, waited behind thick walls and a garrison swollen with elephants from India, living symbols of a king who once believed he commanded a world of trade routes. It made no difference. Chagatai and Ogedei circled the city like wolves. Engineers built trebuchets that thumped like distant thunder. Naphtha streaked through the night like falling stars. Sappers burrowed beneath towers. The garrison fought, the people prayed, the walls shook. When the final breach opened, the city's strength collapsed in waves. Artisans were collected, scholars were spared, others were distributed among officers or sent north. The court had fled. The people remained to pay the cost. Shah Mohammed ran from fortress to fortress, from river to river, from hope to hope. He always arrived too late. Enemies closed, sands shifted, and the empire beneath him cracked like dry clay. He finally reached an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died with only a handful of attendants. A king who lost a kingdom through pride, panic, and fate's indifference. His son Jalal al-Din survived and would become a thorn later. But not now, not against this tide. The fall of Gurganj, ancient Ganj, was the darkest test. The city lay in a maze of canals that choked movement. Its defenders fought with the bravery of men who knew mercy was uncertain. And the Mongols, pushing through mud, water, and stubborn walls, felt frustration rise. Inside the Mongol command, a deeper fracture opened. Jachai urged negotiation, let the city yield and live. Chagatai demanded full punishment. Old wounds resurfaced. Rumors about Jachai's birth sharpened every word. Respect clashed with resentment in the space of a single breath. Genghis Khan sent Ogedei to decide. Ogedei's judgment was merciful in form, brutal in execution. Accept the surrender, then punish the city enough to satisfy Chagatai's demand for an example. The city fell. The argument did not end. And the father watched his sons, and understood that unity in victory would require as much effort as victory in war. Khwarazm felt the weight next, a slow, crushing pressure like a distant storm rolling down from unseen mountains. As the dust of Transoxiana drifted behind the Mongol banners, Talyui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, led a column of riders along the river roads and into the ancient heartland of Persian civilization. These were cities older than memory, places where scholars wrote under lamplight, where markets smelled of saffron and warm bread, where poets had carved their thoughts into the very shape of the language. None of that mattered now. Merv opened its gates early, hoping mercy would take root before violence. Nishapur resisted, and after a Mongol officer was killed in its streets, the city endured a punishment so fierce that its echo would travel along caravan routes for generations. Herat watched, hesitated, opened its gates, closed them again, argued with itself, until time itself betrayed it. The besiegers grew impatient and the city paid in full. Historians would one day argue over the scale of destruction, but those who lived through it did not debate. They remembered only fear, wide, suffocating, and unforgettable. A carpet of dread unrolled from oasis to oasis, not because the Mongols loved violence, but because they understood the strange mathematics of terror. One terrible example could spare them 10 later sieges. They used this knowledge with icy calculation, and once the smoke faded, they sent merchants, tax clerks, and storehouse masters to rebuild granaries and reorder the land. Conquest followed by administration, a rhythm that became the heartbeat of a rising empire. While Talyui worked his will in the Persian East, a different kind of war unfolded over mountains and frozen passes far to the north. Gebe and Subutai, restless shadows of the steppe, sought permission to chase Jalal al-Din, the last surviving prince of Khwarazm, and to look beyond him into lands almost mythic to Mongol eyes. With the Khan's blessing, they slipped westward, skirting the Caspian Sea like ghosts. They defeated a Georgian army that attempted to block their path. They turned north, following the spine of the Caucasus. At Derbent, the ancient gate of the seven climes, they bribed, whispered, and manipulated their way inside. It seemed their army changed direction as easily as the wind changed temperature. Beyond the mountains, the Cuman steppe riders fled before them, then rallied with their Alan allies for one decisive stand. But Gebe and Subutai did not meet strength with strength. They met it with words. They sent gifts to the Cumans, whispering that the Alans intended to sell them if the battle soured. The alliance shattered before the first arrow flew. The Alans were crushed. The Cumans were hunted next. The lesson drifted across the steppe like smoke. Divide your enemies before you destroy them. Alter the map before you set the camp. Their long westward ride ended in a battle that would haunt Slavic memory. At the Kalka River, the princes of Kiev and their allies marched far from home, drawn by rumors and misunderstandings, never realizing they were walking into the hands of two masters of misdirection. The Mongols struck like a sudden wind. Arrows fell in dark waves. Flanks collapsed under pressure so precise it felt like someone reading the ground as if it were a scroll. The Rus' army broke. Gebe and Subutai did not care about capturing cities, not on this far-flung scout of a campaign. They took prisoners, made a grim example atop a bare hill, and turned back toward the east, riding through hostile tribes along the lower Volga. When they returned, they carried no treasure, only knowledge, distances, river routes, mountain passes, the temperament of peoples, the taste of foreign alliances. They returned with maps written not on parchment but in their minds. In the shadow of these conquests came something quieter but no less powerful: administration. The Mongols did not conquer only land, they conquered systems. Darighachi were stationed in major cities to monitor taxes, to gather reports, and to ensure that no governor used his post as a private throne. Roads were patrolled. Relay stations doubled across the horizon like beads on a string. The Yam, the great messenger network, extended outward with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Genghis Khan had not invented government, he had made it travel. In Bukhara, a Persian clerk worked beside a Uyghur scribe, tallying taxes in wheat and silk. In Samarkand, a Muslim judge settled disputes beneath a Mongol seal that ensured his safety. In Merv's bustling markets, a caravan master who once saved an army at a river crossing now carried goods under an exclusive Mongol grant. Why did people obey? Because punishments were immediate, because profits were visible. Because the Mongol order made sense, and because defying it always cost more than bending to it. Yet even as empires bent, the Khan's own family strained. The quarrel between Jacha and Chagatai grew sharper. Old resentments and whispered lineage rumors breathed like embers stirred by wind. It reached a point where even victory could not hide it. Genghis Khan summoned a family council on the banks of the Ili River, where the water ran cold and steady beneath winter sunlight. After long hours, he named Ogedei as heir not for strength but for balance. He could speak to both camps. He could keep peace long enough for greater work to continue. Jachai was given the far western lands, pasture rich, future bright. But fate was cruel. He would die before his father, leaving his branch of the family to carry his claims into new storms. For the moment, the matter was settled. Men returned to their assignments. The world kept turning. The Khan himself rode south. Jalal al-Din had rallied in the Punjab, raising a small but fierce following. On the banks of the Indus River, beneath emerald water and pale sky, the two forces clashed. Jalal al-Din fought like a man born from fire. When defeat became certain, he turned his horse toward the river, spurred it forward, and leapt into the rushing water. Under a hail of Mongol arrows, he swam across, escaping by the width of a breath. Genghis Khan watched from a height and admired him openly. He would have welcomed him as a vassal, but pride and memory chained Jalal to exile. The Mongols did not press deeper into India. They had proved their point. There was no distance beyond their reach. The Western War changed the Mongols. They learned to fight among orchards and deserts, gardens and canals, walls and mountain trails. They saw oil fires, siege mines, and crafts more delicate than anything the steppe had taught them. They took skills home. They took sorrow home. Persian poets mourned for generations. Chinese clerks wrote down the machinery of conquest. And the Khan began to sense, with a strange, unsettling clarity, that a ruler who could shatter and rebuild whole regions might shape the borders of the world itself. In a winter tent near the Oron, the great captains returned one by one. Gibi sat quietly, drawing roots in the ashes with a stick. Subutai tapped distances into the air with his fingers. Mukali sent messages from the north of China. The Khan's sons spoke of what they had seen, what they had learned, what they hoped would come next. Bert listened silently, saving her thoughts for a private hour. Holun looked at her grandsons and remembered the days when a single rabbit caught at dusk meant survival. Outside, yam riders changed horses and disappeared into the night. Dung fires flickered. Iron cooled in winter water. And across the far mountains to the southwest, a realm that had begged for peace once too often was stirring again. When the banners of the west were folded and the dust of Khwarazm drifted behind the horse tails, Genghis Khan turned once more toward the sunrise. He had broken an empire beside the Oxus, sent his commanders to the Black Sea, watched caravan masters count coins under Mongol seals, received the submission of towns that once thought nomads were only a passing storm. Yet among all the reports carried by the yam riders, one steady pulse kept beating from the east, a call he could no longer ignore. The pulse from the east grew louder. Western Zia, the Tangut kingdom, had bowed years before, then slowly stiffened, like a branch bending in the wind only to rise again once the storm seemed far away. The Jin dynasty still clung to the south, wounded but not dead. Border towns watched the horizon and calculated which empire would outlast the other. Genghis Khan did not allow hesitation to ripen into defiance. He returned to the Orkhan, to a camp no longer merely a gathering of yurts but a breathing organism, vast, disciplined, and complex. The Keshig, once only a personal guard, had become a school of command, where the sons of noble families and trusted companions learned the habits of a world-striding state. The yam relay posts now stretched farther than a single rider could cross in a week, horses waiting like coiled springs at every station. Closer to the great tent, Uyghur scribes worked among bundles of bamboo slips and sheaves of paper. Inkstones sat beside saddles. Brushes lay next to quivers. Writing had become as necessary to rule as the bow was to war. Persian clerks, men who had marched east with the armies from Bukhara, balanced ledgers of merchant partners, matching promises of cloth, grain, salt, and credit. At the edge of the council fire stood Yelu Chukai, a quiet, stubborn scholar of kitten blood. He had served the fallen Liao dynasty and read the long histories of China, lines of rise and collapse stretching back through millennia. He did not urge mercy for its own sake. Instead, he spoke of taxes, granaries, and stable revenue. Kill and you take tribute for a day, he told the Khan. Count and you take revenue for a generation. It was advice Genghis could respect. He had learned to use any tool that worked. He did not stop fighting. He learned when to stop destroying. The family at the center of the tent had shifted as well. Jachai ruled the far west, rich in pasture and promise. The old tension with Chagatai had cooled, at least in public, after Ogedei was named heir. Talyui remained closest to his father in the field, tightening sieges with a patience and ferocity that other commanders sometimes lacked. Bert watched her sons with an unblinking calm, her presence a quiet gravity that steadied the household. Holun, older now, surrounded by grandchildren, looked upon the orderly winter camp and remembered years when a marmot snared at dusk had meant one more day of life. To her, the silence and fullness of this camp was a wonder only those who had tasted real hunger could understand. Before the army moved again, the Khan completed the preparations that would shape what followed. The decimal system, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, became not just the structure of the army, but the skeleton of the entire realm. Leaders of thousands were expected not only to ride, but to judge disputes. Over them stood Darighachi, administrators planted like wooden posts across the towns that accepted Mongol rule. They did not invent laws from nothing. They enforced the promises the center had made. If a city had opened early, that mercy was recorded, and protection became a matter of honor. If merchants had provided fodder at a river crossing, their tablets were checked and privileges renewed. If a governor cheated on tax shares, punishment came quickly and publicly. The Yasa was not a scroll on a shelf. It was the living voice of a ruler who wanted soldiers to trust the man at their back, merchants to trust contracts in far towns, and envoys to travel across frontiers without fear. A world without trust collapses. Genghis Khan built a world where trust was enforced with fire and record-keeping. The Western War had taught the Mongols that engineers could be as valuable as archers when a city hid behind walls. So craftsmen became part of the moving core, men who could raise counterweight engines in days, build ladders, mine beneath gates, set fires to supporting beams, and use water as a weapon. A unit of water engineers, men from lands of ancient canals, traveled with them. If a river could be diverted to flood a wall, they tried. If the attempt failed, they studied the failure and found another path. This attention to detail was the line between a raider and a conqueror. As the second decade of the century deepened, attention turned again to Western Xia. Years earlier, when the Khan first tested their strength, the Tangut court at Zhongxing had sworn loyalty, paid tribute, sent hostages, and agreed to a marriage alliance. They had promised support when summoned. Now, as the Mongol Empire stretched from the Orkhan to the Oxus, the Tangut nobles convinced themselves that distance had made them safe. They delayed sending troops. They negotiated with the south. Their letters hinted at a future in which Mongol suzerainty was optional. And then came the deepest wound. Envoys had been harmed again. To harm a messenger was to strike at the bones of the world. To Genghis Khan, it was an offense that heaven itself demanded he answer. He resolved to ride. The road to Zhongxing Ningxia ran through the Gansu corridor, where mountains pressed desert flat and ancient towns clung to narrow rivers. Subutai rode on one wing, ordered to move with savage speed and unravel the line of towns that fed the Tangut court. Talyui moved on another, making sure no garrison could gather safely behind him. Genghis Khan rode with the main body. The Mongols crossed the gravel and sand plains other armies feared in summer. They chose late autumn and winter instead, when heat could not grind a horse to exhaustion, when cold sharpened riders rather than crippling them. People along the Huang and Xiang rivers awoke one morning to see dust where the land should have been empty, and riders where no sane commander would send an army. At Hui City and Liangzhu, the Mongols tried every gate. A city that opened early kept its craftsmen. A city that fired on envoys saw mangonels rise and stones howl through the air. Subutai carved new roads between towns, turning the Tanguts' lifelines into nooses. Caravans that once carried silk, paper, and metal now carried news of disaster back to Zhongxing. The Tangut court sent pleas for help in every direction. They prepared a final stand in the Helan Mountains. Then came Lingwu, the keystone on the Yellow River, the threshold to the Tangut heartland. The Mongols surrounded it like a closing fist. They tested the walls. They noted where the stone was weakest. Then they applied everything they had learned in China, sappers digging beneath towers, engine crews striking the same point for hours, a sudden flag sending all engines to shift their aim at once, smashing stone with perfectly timed force. When the breach opened, the first men through were not left to die. This was no reckless sacrifice. It was a lesson in precision, a glimpse of an empire that had learned to attack not with fury alone, but with method. The fighting at Lingwu rolled inward like a tide pulling stone from a shoreline. Each day the Mongols pressed closer, and each night the Tangut court in Zhongxing felt the circle constrict a little more, like a fist closing around an exhausted heart. Western Xia did not fall only because the Mongols were relentless. It fell because its own court was drowning in noise. Inside Zhongxing's walls, ministers with polished ranks shouted over one another, convinced that victory hid somewhere inside their sentences. Old factions returned to old quarrels. One group argued for flight into distant valleys. Another swore the walls could outlast any siege. Another whispered of compromise and begged for terms that would preserve noble privilege. Their ruler sent mixed messages, telling different men different promises, as if contradiction itself could delay fate. In the Mongol camp, these letters were read in silence. Their meaning was obvious. Zhongxing hoped time would save it. But time now served only one man. Genghis Khan pushed beyond the Helan Mountains and entered the curled arm of the Yellow River, where Zhongxing rested like a trapped animal. The city's defenses were not trivial. Earthworks, ditches, engineers skilled in fire and stone. Yet the Mongol siege crept inward with cold patience. The engine park grew by the week, frames rising like skeletal trees, ropes stretched taut, counterweights ready to fall. A constant stream of messages passed between the tents of the commanders. Talyui commanded the siege lines with quiet, merciless discipline. Subutai patrolled the ring, making certain no hope of rescue could reach the city. And Genghis himself rode slowly along the perimeter, speaking to commanders of hundreds and thousands, steadying their minds in the long winter of waiting. He did not promise victory. He promised to remain until victory came. There is an old tale that once again the Mongols tried to bend the Yellow River against the city. But the river is no obedient servant. It twists and tears, loyal to nothing but its own violence. Whether true or not, the effort showed a habit deep in the Mongol mind. If nature could be harnessed, it would be. If water failed, fire followed. If fire failed, mines and rams chewed the walls with slow, stubborn hunger. In these months, news arrived that struck deeper than a breach in stone. Jachai was dead. Far away in the west, the Khan's eldest son had ruled with generosity, holding cities that once resisted him, earning loyalty even from former enemies. Yet the whisper that had tainted his birth, the rumor that had haunted him since childhood, rose again now that he could no longer stand to defend himself. Chagatai kept his face rigid. Ogedei spoke only in gentle tones. Talyui returned to the siege lines without comment. Genghis Khan entered a tent with Bert and remained with her a long while. They spoke not as rulers, but as two people who had survived hunger and exile, and who now understood that even a world conqueror could not command the length of a life. When the Khan emerged, his pace had not changed. The siege continued, orders moved, engines fired, but those who knew him said a quiet line had appeared across his face and it never lifted again. The final days of Zhongxing unfolded in familiar patterns of desperation. The Tangut court asked for terms. They sent a son, soft words and promises. The Khan refused. Only the ruler who had broken past oaths could kneel and beg forgiveness. Only his presence could matter. He did not come, the engines sang again, stones struck the weakened walls, towers split. Ladders rose with rungs wet from the hands of men climbing toward death. When the breach opened, the Mongol vanguard poured through. Zhongxing fell in dust and fire. The Tangut ruler was taken and punished. The dynasty ended. Its artisans were gathered, its archives sorted, its poets scattered into winds they could not outrun. It was during this long siege that fate altered the final chapter of the Khan's life. He still rode, still hunted, still inspected camps with the old fire. But age had finally drawn its hand across him. Some say he fell from his horse, others that he took a fever, others that years of war had found the right moment to exact their cost. Stories would later be embroidered like silk tales of betrayal, of insult, of secret wounds. Yet these were only shadows cast by a simple truth. Genghis Khan began to fail. He did not halt the siege. He did not soften the punishment he had decreed. He summoned his sons. He confirmed Ogedei as heir. He commanded them to finish the war in the north of China and then to face whichever frontier threatened next. He told them to guard the yam, to protect envoys, to treat merchants as partners, to remember Baljuna where loyalty had been proven knee-deep in mud and hunger. He spoke privately to Talyui, entrusting him with the fragile center of the empire. He spoke quietly to Bert, and no scribe recorded those words. His death came away from the siege, somewhere in the high folds of the Liupan Mountains where the air was sharp and cold. The Keshig shrouded the news in silence. The camp changed nothing. Engines still hurled stones, messengers still rode. The final Tangut ruler died as ordered. When the Khan's body could be moved, an escort carried him north. Legends grew like weeds around this final journey. That the escort killed every passerby to keep the path secret. That horses trampled the burial ground until all trace vanished. That a forest was planted over him. That a river was diverted to hide him beneath its current. The Borjajan elders say only this: he was taken toward Burkhan Khaldun and the place is not marked. A king of the steppe did not need a stone to command reverence. He needed only memory and obedience. The funeral rites were simple, as all the great things of the grassland are. Black banners were folded. White banners rose. Horses circled a mound of earth that never revealed itself, and the wind carried the story onward. The shamans lifted their drums beneath the wide, breathless sky, calling upward to the eternal blue, asking it to receive the soul of the man who had bent rivers, nations, and memories to his will. Around them, the warriors who had once knelt with him in the mud of Baljuna stood motionless, eyes lowered, remembering the bitter taste of muddy water and the weight of hunger shared in silence. Women who had wrapped their children against winter's knives wept softly, mourning the ruler who had turned dangerous roads into guarded lifelines stretching from one horizon to the next. Horses were turned north, then south, then east, and west, each direction a promise that the army would ride again, because the dead man had said the work was not a fire that could be allowed to die. Far to the east, Mukeli still held the Mongol front in northern China with a patient firmness that impressed even those sworn against him. Under his hand, prefectures were kept in order, registers balanced, and garrisons persuaded or broken as needed. Some cities resisted. Some opened their gates after their governors quarreled or fled. But all of them felt the shadow of a will that had begun long before and would now continue through others. The path Genghis Khan had carved was laid clear before his sons. The Jin court had already fled south, abandoning Zhongdu, carrying their fears with them into the lowlands. They were running from a storm that had not yet finished its turning. The last camp of Genghis Khan did not scatter at once. It breathed in place like a great animal standing still to honor its fallen heart. Distant princes rode in. Messengers flashed along the yam routes with tablets that parted doors and gates. The Keshig guarded a silent tent where no early voice called for a horse. Engineers cleaned their tools. Scribes tied their lists. Women mended garments for the days to come. The wind moved through the Oron Valley, whispering through ancient deer stones and forgotten graves, reminding the living that the steppe had swallowed empires before and would swallow this moment too. But it would not swallow the order the Khan had planted. That would remain. When the escort reached the north and the grave was given to silence, the warriors saddled their ponies once more. Ogedei would rise in proper assembly. Talyui would hold the center until the rites were complete. Chagatai would speak with his usual iron tongue and then keep faith. The sons of Jachai, Batu among them, would watch, waiting for the future to open. Subutai would unroll his maps again, tracing rivers and passes with cold precision. And Yelu Chukai would bring his tall stacks of numbers, explaining how to tax without breaking fields, how to rule without bribery devouring the law. Far away, rulers whispered that the death of the great Khan would bring back the old order. They had not yet understood what had changed. The army moved, not toward battle, but toward a riverbank where the words of a new beginning would be spoken. In the rings of tents, elders told the young what the old man had built. They spoke of the sable coat given in Togrul's camp, of the dawn when the Merkit stole a wife and paid with their strength, of Baljuna where men swore loyalty in mud and hunger, of Jandu's burning gates, of the Oxus, of the Kalka River where whole armies cracked under storms of arrows, of Lingwu where walls shook beneath engines, and of a fall from a saddle that had shaken them all more than any enemy charge. None of these stories were endings. They were footsteps on the road ahead. The death of Genghis Khan did not leave the sky empty, it left instructions. It left expectation. It left the living shaped by his will and ready to continue it. The tent of mourning stood still. Guards shifted without speaking. Couriers flew along the relay lines. From forest edges to southern market towns, the word rose. A Kurultai would be held. A new Khan would be chosen. In late summer of the second year, the clans gathered. Elders, captains, and envoys circled beneath the broad banners. Chagatai spoke sharply as he always had. The sons of Jachai watched in silence. Talyui held the gathering steady, and Ogedei open-faced, loud-laughing, a man who could drink deep and listen well-weighted. When the voices rose in one great shout, Ogedei was lifted, declared Great Khan. By the custom of the herders, a ruler was judged first by generosity. Ogedei opened the storehouses. Horses were gifted to worn-out captains. Robes to loyal men. Rich gifts to allies across the plains. A hand that held back in times of celebration would find only empty loyalty when winter came. Ogedei understood this well. And from that tone of strength and open-handedness came a new center for the expanding world. Karakorum rose in the Oron Valley, near the ancient stones carved by forgotten kings. Not a city of towering walls, but a planned camp growing into a beating heart, built at a crossroads where the yam lines met, where scribes, generals, merchants, and messengers could always find the Khan's fire burning. Workshops appeared along the river like quiet constellations of firelight. Smiths hammered iron until sparks drifted into the dusk like falling embers. Bow-makers bent seasoned wood over their knees. Potters shaped clay that spun beneath their palms. Carpenters raised beams hewn from distant forests. Storehouses rose along the water's edge, long shadows stretching over the banks like sleeping guardians. A timber palace slowly climbed upward, its pillars carved by artisans taken from fallen cities, hands once loyal to other kings now shaping the house of a new order. Markets were arranged in soft clusters. One for Muslim traders, one for Chinese merchants, others for wanderers whose tongues carried the dust of deserts and seas. In the palace yard stood a tree of silver, its branches chiming faintly in the wind, beside a strange fountain fashioned by a French craftsman drawn across continents. From its mouths flowed wine, mare's milk, and mead, a shimmering theatrical wonder meant to show that any talent, no matter how foreign, would find a place if it served the court. Within the wooden halls, administration finally gained walls to shelter it from the endless wind. Tables, chairs, and ledgers made order easier to hold. Here, Yelu Chukai found a ruler willing to listen. Ogedei did not care to be adored by farmers. He cared for flow, grain, salt, cloth, coin, moving cleanly from field to army, from market to campaign. So the kitten scholar proposed a world recorded on paper. Registers of households, measured fields, counted granaries, fixed levies, officials who took grain and cloth instead of lives. Ogedei agreed. Under Yelu Chukai's hand, the early chaos of quotas hardened into a system with numbers behind it. Abuse did not vanish, but now it had a shape, a name, a punishment. As order deepened, the relay system grew across the continent like a web spun in silence. Posts rose a day's ride apart, spare horses waited in the shadows. A clerk stamped a tablet, and a messenger thundered on. A message from Karakorum could reach the valleys of North China in days, slipping across the Gobi through hands trained to protect the word it carried. Travelers with Pesa tokens moved as though escorted by the wind. A caravan master could demand shelter and oats. A monk could cross 3 languages and not be robbed. The roads, quiet, steady, relentless, became the empire's most enduring creation. But the army did not sleep. Mukeli, the old pillar of the north, had died with honor. New pillars rose in his place. Campaigns against the Jin resumed, a slow grinding pressure meant to break the last strongholds. The Jin court had fled to Kaifeng and farther still, hoping distance might save them. But distance meant nothing to men who crossed rivers on winter ice. The Mongol armies moved across the frozen Yellow River, their ponies steady on glass-hard surfaces where heavier foes would drown. Siege engines crafted by Chinese and kitten hands rolled behind them like iron-breathing beasts. At Kaifeng, fire screamed from the walls, naphtha bombs bursting like suns, fire lances spitting flame in desperate arcs. Famine followed. The Jin emperor fled once more. By 1234, the dynasty collapsed, cracked by Mongol pressure and the weight of its own fractures. The Song soon learned that the riders of the north were not content with borders drawn by another people's fear. Yet before the south could be addressed, the west called. The lands of Jachai's sons spread wide, filled with dangers and hungers. Batu, steady, patient, unhurried, gathered his strength. He had the rare talent of working beside Subutai without jealousy, a rare gift in the House of Kings. And Subutai, returning from his long eastern sweep, held maps in his mind as if they were carved into bone. Ogedei chose to strike, to clear the Kipchak steppe, to punish the Cumans for raiding Mongol subjects, to test the stone-walled cities west of the forests, cities that had heard only rumors of an army that never tired, never ran out of horses. The muster was immense. Princes from every branch of the family arrived with their tumens. Gayuk, son of the great Khan, Mongke, eldest son of Talyui, Kadin from Ogedei's line, Orda from the house of Jachai. The wings of the army stretched so far that 100 miles could lie between them, yet they could strike the same point on the same day, guided by Subutai's quiet calculations, shaped by years of learning how the earth itself could become a weapon. Winter carried them toward Europe, ice hardened rivers into glass roads. Snow hid the thunder of hooves. The first blows shattered the Volga Bulgars. Cities along the lower Volga fell like branches in a storm. Then the wings turned west. Polovtsian riders scattered. The Cumans fled, rallied, fled again. The princes of the Rus gathered in uneasy councils, proud, divided, too suspicious to stand as one. The Mongols did not wait. Town after town fell along the upper Volga and the Oka. Engines smashed gates. Sledges dragged siege towers across winter roads. By spring of 1241, one wing reached Poland, another Hungary. Subutai sent Baydar and Kadin through the Polish plains to draw Europe's western lords away. Krakow burned. At Legnica, knights and Teutonic brothers tried to stand. Smoke, feigned retreat, and sudden violence broke their line. The Duke fell, His banners fell beside him. The diversion worked. And while Europe stared at the burning fields of Poland, Batu and Subutai crossed the Carpathians by more than one road, slipping like shadows into the Hungarian heartland. King Bela retreated to a marshy island near the Sajo River, trusting a single bridge, one narrow spine of wood and rope, to hold back the oncoming storm. The storm was already there. The Mongols built two bridges. In the dark hours, while the Hungarian camp slept in its ring of fires, men moved like shadows along the riverbank, carrying timbers and rope. Piles were driven quietly into the mud. Planks were laid where scouts had felt the riverbed with their own feet and found it shallow. By dawn, there was more than one path across the Sajo. The Hungarians saw only the old bridge, so that was where the noise began. Drums, shouts, the crush of troops pushing toward the obvious crossing. While eyes fixed on that chaos, Subutai sent a heavy wedge of horse across the hidden structures, hooves drumming on fresh wood, to fall on the Hungarian flank and rear at once. Arrows did what arrows always did, then panic finished the work. Tents collapsed. Lines dissolved. Men stumbled in mud thickened with blood and broken gear. On the plain near a small village that would be remembered as Mohai, bodies lay scattered like discarded shields. The air smelled of iron, smoke, and trampled grass. Loot was heaped in rough piles. The army did not celebrate for long, it moved. Remnants were hunted down across the fields and forests. Then the riders turned south, spilling into Croatia and Dalmatia. In stone halls far away, European statesmen stared at maps and murmured in languages that had never dreamed of the word Mongol. They did not know how to describe an enemy that treated winter as an ally and built bridges in a single night where locals needed a season. While Europe reeled, a different blow fell at the heart of the empire. In Karakorum, after a winter of heavy drinking and a fever that would not turn, Ogedei died. A world that had learned to move at the speed of a galloping courier was suddenly bound by the older speed of ritual. The princes in the west were tied to a rule older than any city they burned. A new great Khan must be chosen in assembly. Batu had no love for Gayuk and refused to bow to him outside a proper Kurultai. Gayuk would not accept that Batu had acted only as a dutiful son of Jachai. Subutai, practical as ever, argued for a winter push into Austria and deeper still. The order that came was simple: withdraw. The wings turned east. Hooves that might have thundered along the Danube faded into the snow. Chroniclers in cloisters and courts wrote of miracles, angels, providence. But the reason was written in Mongol custom, not in heaven. The house had to come home to choose a head. Even while the head was unsettled, the body of the empire continued to shift and grow. Talyui had already died, giving himself in a ritual offering when Ogedei's life hung in the balance. His widow, Sorgatani Biki, took his place as guardian of their sons. Men who disliked praising a woman still admitted, in private if not aloud, that she had the cool judgment of a seasoned commander. She found teachers in languages and law, taught her sons to respect priests from many faiths, insisted that men of talent be allowed to work without fear. She did not sit in councils as an ornament. She weighed alliances, steered quarrels, and watched the balance of the house. When Gayuk rose as great Khan after a regency ruled by his mother Torjin, it was Sorgatani who quietly shielded her son's interests without open confrontation. Gayuk's rule was stiff and brittle. His manner offended Batu, unsettled ministers, and hinted at storms that never fully broke. He died on patrol in the west before his rigidity could tear the lineage apart. Through all of this, the machinery Genghis had built and Ogedei had refined kept turning. Daraghachi continued to write from far-flung towns about taxes, floods, shortages, and surpluses. The yam relays still changed horses in dust and snow. Ortog merchants took advances from the court, funded caravans, and repaid their debts with tolls and duties gathered on the road. Craftsmen brought from Zhengdu and Kaifeng now built siege engines in Samarkand and Bukhara. Ideas moved as easily as horses. Paper money, proven in the south, was studied and weighed. Gunpowder recipes traveled with engineers, ending up in notebooks written in Syriac and Arabic. In a tent warmed by braziers, a Persian surgeon discussed cautery with a Chinese physician, both of them agreeing that a saddle sore on a good pony could stop a campaign more surely than any argument about humors. In the north of China, the war against the Song deepened. The Song navy ruled the rivers with long, heavy war junks. Their shipyards were furnaces of activity, producing hull after hull. The Mongols learned to float the way they had learned to climb walls, by watching, forcing captured shipwrights to teach them, and hiring pilots from people who already knew the currents. Once Admiral Yuan of the Song used fire ships and chains across the Yangtze to smash a Mongol fleet. Flames rolled downriver and burned timbers cracked like bones. The Mongols watched, remembered, rebuilt. When they returned, they came with new hull designs, new tactics, and a different use of the river. They waited for winter's low water, for ice and shallow channels, and brought siege engines to towns that had believed the river was a wall no army could breach. Inside the imperial family, the great division of land that had begun as mere family allotments hardened into recognizable realms. In the west, the Jochid lands of the steppe matured into a Khanate Europeans would call the Golden Horde, a sweep of grass and riverways that turned fur, fish, and passing caravans into wealth, and eyed the Black Sea and the Balkans with steady attention. In Transoxiana, the Chagatai realm held the route between Samarkand and Kashgar, blending Turkic and Mongol customs into one courtly rhythm. In Mongolia and northern China, the Talyuid branch held Karakorum and the central claim to the title of Great Khan. Lines that had begun as family gifts became borders where different mixtures of law, faith, and habit settled in layers. The center still commanded, but it did so now through men who had their own ambitions, wrapped in language about service to the greater house. Ogedei's years had drawn two vast strokes across the map, one south through former Jin lands toward the Song, one west with Batu and Subutai across snow, rivers, forests, and cities that had once thought themselves too distant to fear riders from the steppe. The southern line demanded siege arts and patience. The western line demanded winter marches, night bridges on piles, and a mind that could imagine three separate wings, unseen by one another for days, striking three towns in a single coordinated blow. The postal relays and merchant partnerships bound both lines to Karakorum. The sacred rule about envoys allowed these lines to speak to the center and to one another. The habit of lifting able men, whether born in felt tents or behind stone walls, kept the structure from cracking every time one supporting pillar fell. When people picture the age of Genghis, they often see only galloping hooves and burning horizons. The age of Ogedei added something quieter: rhythm, orders leaving Karakorum at dawn, reports returning at dusk. Caravans planned for seasons when grass would be thick near the relay posts. Judges setting days to hear disputes, then recording settlements so memory would not have to carry everything. Captains training their men through long winters so that spring was for moving, not learning. A boy in the Keshig watched councils and learned when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. A girl married into the Ogedei clan discovered that a letter carried along the yam could bring an answer from the center before the season changed. By their fires at night, as they polished arrowheads and checked bowstrings, warriors spoke less about borders and more about roads. They could ride from the Altai to the Caspian and never once fear a roadside thief. The empire breathed through its roads. A message could leave Karakorum at dawn, carried beneath a felt cloak, and reach Bukhara fast enough for the reply to matter. A Persian merchant could be asked for lamps, and weeks later, armed escorts would bring them in wagons that smelled of cedar and dust. To those who lived beneath this vast order, empire felt like a road that never broke, a path that always held, no matter how far it stretched. The voice of Genghis, the voice that had chosen Ogedei, still echoed in the councils of his sons, nephews, and their sons beyond them. But power was no longer a single thread passed from hand to hand. It was a living thing that needed choices, discipline, and the right pair of eyes watching every frontier. When Ogedei died, the center trembled, and a woman steadied it. Torjine, his chief wife, gathered the seals of authority and held them with a calm that hid steel. She bribed, threatened, soothed, and pushed until support gathered behind her son. Soon, Gayuk sat upon the felt throne at Karakorum. His rule burned fast. He drove ministers hard. He drank harder. He tried to bend the princes of Jochai's line to his will. He died on the road to the west, still planning a reckoning with Batu. Again the center shuddered. Again a woman caught it before it split. Agul Kamish held the regency in name, but her hands were not strong enough to grip the loyalties that mattered. Across the campfires behind quiet tent flaps, another presence rose, soft-spoken, patient, impossible to ignore. Sorgatani, widow of Talyui, mother of Mernk, mother of Kublai, mother of Hulagu, mother of Eric Burke, a mind sharper than most blades in the steppe. She raised her sons with tutors from every corner of the world, Persian scholars, Uyghur scribes, Buddhist monks, Nestorian priests. She taught them to read laws, trust the wise, honor faith, and listen longer than they spoke. When the great Kurultai finally met, recorded carefully by Chinese and Persian writers alike, Mernk was lifted as Great Khan. His first acts were swift and cold. Men who had sold offices, squeezed peasants, or lined their pockets with false levies disappeared without ceremony. Talyui's line now held the reins. Mernk ruled with a heavy calm. Not with wine, but with numbers. Not with boasts, but with plans. He loved lists, reports, and commanders who thought in seasons, not days. He kept Yelu Chukai's system, registration, measured taxes, honest officials. He promoted those who could not be bribed. And then he opened two great fronts. One toward the south, toward the Song, where fields and rivers fed the richest corners of China. The other toward the west, toward the broken remains of Khwarazm, the stone-hard castles of the Nizari, and the ancient city of the Caliph on the Tigris. Hulagu, Talyui's third son, rode west with an army that felt like a moving nation. Engineers, sappers, Persian accountants, Armenian masons, Georgian carpenters. Stone-eaters gnawed through mountain fortresses. The strongholds of the Nizari cracked and fell, their libraries carried out in bundles before the torches came. Then came Baghdad, a lighthouse of learning. A city of poets, markets, gardens, and centuries of scholars. Hulagu sent envoys. The Caliph replied with the confidence of old glory, not present strength. The siege closed, the stones fell, walls trembled. When the city opened, the river ran thick, black with the ink of ruined libraries, dark with blood. The world shifted. A court rose at Maragha, then Tabriz, where Nasir al-Din Tusi built an observatory that watched the stars through brass instruments forged in many cultures. But power calls to power. In the north, Burke of the Jochid line, now a Muslim, looked at Baghdad's fall and felt anger strike like metal on metal. The friendship between Hulagu and Burke twisted, then broke. Burke reached south and clasped hands with the Mamluks of Egypt. And so Mongols met Mongols through other men's shields. At Ayn Jalut, under the burning September sun, the Mamluks feigned retreat, sprang their trap, and shattered the Mongol detachment left in Syria. Kitbuka fell. The spell of Mongol invincibility cracked, not everywhere but here in this one hot valley. The family, once united by hunger and hope, was now divided by belief, territory, and power. In the east, Mernk pressed the Song hard. He needed river fleets, grain stores, and a chain of sieges stretching across southern China. He sent Kublai to the northern front and left Eric Burke to guard the homeland. City after city fell as engineers built towers that moved like walking fortresses and bridges that floated on winter water. But in Sichuan, Mernk died. Disease or exhaustion, no one could swear which. His death loosened every knot the empire had tied. Two brothers claimed the throne. Kublai in the north at Shangdu, Eric Burke in Karakorum with the homeland princes. The civil war that followed rippled across Asia, messengers racing, armies shifting like tides, loyalties splitting as old alliances cracked. Kublai won with patience, distance, and supply lines that choked his brother's strength. Eric Burke yielded, he would die a prisoner. Kublai set his throne in Khanbalik, today's Beijing, and named his dynasty in Chinese words, anchoring a nomad empire inside the walls of ancient states. Yuan, the name was pressed into seals and painted on banners, a new word laid over an old world. In the halls of the capital, the court moved with the weight and ceremony of Chinese emperors, even as horsehair standards still snapped in the wind outside the walls. Kublai was not his grandfather. He kept the bones of the steppe, the decimal ranks of tens, hundreds, thousands, the tassels of horsehair that had brushed against armor since the first musters on the Anan. But he became something else as well. A ruler who sat in layered robes, reading folded memorials written by Chinese scholars, and answering them in measured, careful sentences. He ordered the Grand Canal repaired, its long waterway scraped and dredged so that grain from the southern rice fields could slide north toward the warehouses of the capital. He flooded the markets with paper money and insisted it be taken as payment, backing it with stocks of grain and the promise of tax receipts. Granaries rose like quiet fortresses against hunger, meant to soften famine before it sharpened. Envoys came from far coasts and inland seas, from Venice, from the Pope. Kublai listened while a Franciscan friar named William of Rubruck spoke of the shape of the earth and the quarrels between Greek and Latin rites. A Venetian merchant family arrived, their young son watching everything with wide, restless eyes. Later, that boy would write about these roads and courts and distant fires, and Europe would lie awake reading his memories. In Dadu's palace, the halls were filled with a mix of lords no earlier Chinese court had seen together. Mongols in fur-trimmed coats, Uyghur scribes with ink-stained fingers, Turks with curved blades, Tibetans in layered wool, Persians with their measured speech, Chinese officials in silk. None of them forgot who they were. All of them learned how to move inside one house without breaking it. The Southern Song tested everything. The Song Navy was strong, ships with ribbed hulls, disciplined crews, ministers who understood that in a land of rivers and marshes, water was a road if you knew how to use it. Kublai answered by building a navy of his own. Captured shipwrights taught others how to shape keels and ribs, how to mount engines on decks, how to design river craft that could carry archers and stones. The Mongol and allied armies moved along the Yangtze, then into the lowland maze of lakes and canals. Year after year, they chewed away at the list of Song strongholds, one city, one port, one bend of river at a time. In the end, it came down to a single battle at sea. Near Yamen, under a hard, bright sky, the last Song forces gathered. The boy emperor stood aboard one of the chained ships, watched over by his minister, Lu Xiufu. To prevent flight, the Song had lashed their vessels together. What should have been a fleet became a floating wall. Zhang Hongfen, the Mongol admiral, pressed in, firepots arced between decks. Smoke crawled along the rigging. The wind, which the defenders had trusted, dropped and turned against them. As the line buckled, Lu Xiufu wrapped the child in his arms and stepped with him into the sea. Water closed over them. With that one act, the last dynasty of the south vanished beneath the waves, and all of China fell under the rule of the house that had begun in felt tents on the Anan River. Kublai's eyes did not stay on China alone. He turned his gaze toward distant coasts and unknown islands, places he had only heard in the stories of sailors and merchants. Fleets went out toward Japan, their hulls built in Korean shipyards, their crews a mix of Korean, Chinese, and Mongol command. The first armada reached the islands, fought on their beaches, and then shattered beneath a sudden storm. The second, larger and more heavily armed, came years later and met the same fate. Japanese chroniclers called the storms divine winds. Kublai saw something more practical. Ships built in haste, filled with men who could not speak one another's languages fluently, thrown into the mouth of a typhoon. He sent armies south into the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, into Pagan, into Champa, into the green rice fields of Dai Viet. Capitals were taken, terms were dictated. Then the monsoon rains returned. Jungle and fever followed. Victories turned into negotiations, and negotiations into stale, uneasy arrangements that never quite settled. No steppe rider can gallop through a mangrove swamp. The empire learned that reaching a place with banners and drums was not the same as holding it. While the Toluid line shaped China, other branches grew in their own directions. In the west, the golden horde of the Jochid house planted its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga, where the Volga and Don bent toward one another like joined arms. There, between open grasslands and wooded river valleys, a new rhythm took shape. The horde ruled the Russian principalities through charters, yarliks, that named a grand prince and gave him the right to collect tribute for the Khan. Princes rode to Sarai, stood in its halls, and returned with documents that carried the weight of steppe and city both. Some, like Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod and Vladimir, learned to move inside this system, to use it as a shield against neighbors even as they bowed to the horde. Caravans rolled between Sarai and the Black Sea. Furs, wax, grain, and slaves changed hands under watchful eyes. Mosques rose near markets where Italian merchants kept their warehouses. The horde became both steppe state and river kingdom. Farther south, the Ilkhanate in Iran struggled with the scars of Baghdad and with famine, revolt, and the slow work of rebuilding. Under Abaka and later under Ghazan, the court embraced Islam and tried to stitch the land together with law and reform. Rashid al-Din, born a Jew, later a Muslim, a physician and a statesman, rose as vizier. He began writing a history that dared to weave Chinese, Indian, Islamic, and Mongol stories into one long tapestry. Reports came to him from governors, travelers, and scholars scattered across the old empire. The Ilkhanate's mints struck coins with new weights and designs. They tried issuing paper money, but without the broad, disciplined machinery that Kublai had in China, the experiment faltered. At Meregha, the observatory Kublai's kin had funded continued its work. Star tables compiled their echoed outwards, shaping the studies of astronomers from Damascus to Samarkand. Between these western states and Kublai's Yuan lay the realm of the Chagatai. Here, princes walked a narrow line, balancing Turkic customs with Mongol legal habits. Kaidu, grandson of Ogedei, refused to bow to Kublai's claims. His long war across Central Asia kept roads dangerous, caravans nervous, and armies stretched thin on both sides. The struggle whispered another truth into the ears of all who watched. No single man could now command effortless obedience across the entire span of Genghis Khan's conquests. Each branch guarded its own center. Each spoke of unity while counting its own herds, its own markets, its own border forts. And yet beneath these shifting powers, the tools built by the first generation still worked. The yam relays ferried orders, rumors, and reports across plains and mountains. Envoys rode with Pesa tablets that flashed like small shields of authority, doors still opened before them. Merchants maintained their partnerships with governors and princes, sending flour, rope, metal, and cloth to feed wars and trade alike. The decimal organization of the army remained the skeleton beneath every campaign plan. Law still shielded the messenger and punished the man who stole a relay horse. Priests, monks, imams, lamas, and friars moved along the same roads, untroubled by local officials who knew better than to touch them. On those roads, a Franciscan friar could drink fermented mare's milk in a smoky tent one week, eat pilaf beneath painted arches in a Persian caravanserai the next, and then bow days later before a Chinese magistrate robed in silk, still traveling under the same sky, still moving along the same unbroken web of paths that the riders of the steppe had thrown over half the world. The empire did not shape every land into its own reflection. Instead, it wove a path between them, a long, quiet road where a traveler could pass from desert to forest, from river delta to mountain pass, with a kind of safety no earlier age had ever dared to imagine. And along those roads, the world began to exchange not only goods, but pieces of itself. Paper, born from the damp rooms of the southern mills, drifted westward and settled into foreign hands. Gunpowder, once a guarded curiosity, crept along the same arteries and altered the way stone walls trembled under siege. Near distant palaces, Iranian patterns curved across Chinese tiles, catching light in glazes that shimmered like cooled moonfire. Physicians traced pulses with fingers trained in two traditions, mixing the observations of Avicenna with quiet techniques learned far from their homelands. Accountants in the Yuan court filled ledgers with columns inspired by Persian order. Chinese astronomers learned to align their instruments with a precision that Muslim scholars had practiced for generations. The roads carried knowledge as easily as they carried soldiers, and then, just as easily, they carried ruin. In the middle of the 14th century, a sickness rose from the high plateaus, a quiet darkness that moved with caravans and wind-beaten sailors. At Kaffa, on the edge of the Black Sea, it clung to the hulls of ships and rode south into the warm harbors of the Mediterranean. What the world would later call the Black Death walked those same safe roads and drifted into cities that had once rejoiced in their connection. Markets where merchants had shouted now stood silent. Doors stayed barred. Streets lay open and empty beneath the sun. No emperor summoned it. No rival plotted it. It was simply the shadowed price of a world whose threads had been tied too tightly together. Yet beneath all of this, behind the trade, the knowledge, the ruin, the memory of Genghis Khan remained like a spine running through the generations. His laws, never gathered into any single volume, lived instead in the breath of proclamations and in judgments spoken around firelight. They lived in the habits of men who had once listened to him, and in the stories their sons repeated. The secret history, written down in a language twisted through Chinese letters, preserved his early hungers, his quarrels, and the rough music of his youth. Persian historians placed him inside a story that began with Adam and with the kings of Iran. Chinese chronicles wrote of how a tent-born court could become a dynasty without ever becoming ordinary. Across every version, across every tongue, the same truths remained. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, welcomed skill, and protected the messenger, because a world without safe words between rulers is a world doomed to burn. As the empire aged, its heart drifted. Karakorum's wood darkened beneath wind and frost. Konbalik Dadu drew power downward like a lodestone, its granaries and river fleets beating in slow, steady rhythm. Sarai grew along the Volga with its mosques and market stalls. Tabriz hummed with caravans that crossed from Anatolia to the sea. Each place wore the Mongol legacy differently, like a coat cut in many styles. But the traveler who crossed from one realm to the next would always notice the same signs. The black tug banner swaying outside a commander's tent, the yam station with its waiting horses, the clerk stamping a peso with unbroken authority and the unspoken promise, whispered in every outpost and every town that harming a messenger meant punishment swift and absolute. Those were the last echoes of the boy beside the Anan River, who once looked across the steppe and imagined a world stitched together not by walls, but by movement. Centuries later, long after his banners had faded and his sons had built and broken their own dominions, elders still rode out to Burkhan Khaldun. They carried no stone to place on a grave they could not name. They carried only memory, a quiet loyalty passed from breath to breath, carried in rituals older than any chronicle. Far from that mountain, rulers in distant cities traced their lineage back to the house of the Blue Wolf and the fallow doe to justify the right to rule. Some whispered his name with bitterness, some with awe, and others with that uneasy mixture reserved for those who changed the world in ways too vast to measure. And still everywhere his vision had reached, the threads remained. Where a courier galloped beneath safe conduct, where a merchant demanded fair measure under a seal that had crossed 3 generations, where a judge allowed a Brahmin, a monk, and a muezzin to speak their cases without fear. There, in those quiet corners of order amid the drifting dust of centuries, the faint outline of his first intention remained intact. A road that did not break, a message that could always pass, a promise that distance itself could be conquered.